It's Rose Kaz, the femme founder of the Backstage Pass, and excited to bring another big thinker into these small talks. We have been having talks all week for the past week about different topics as they pertain to our core values on the Backstage Pass, which is to collaborate, elevate, and inspire with women, femme forward leaders all around the world. So super excited to have the opportunity to speak with Ann Hodder-Smith. Sorry, let me say that again. Ann Hodder-Shippe. Yes, I knew I was going to botch. I was like, it looks just like it says. Let me figure out a way to not say it correctly. Please excuse me. We will also be joined by some of the junior board members of the LBI Backstage Pass. I think we're just waiting for them to come to the green room here. So today's topic, we're getting into a conversation about not necessarily, we're not talking about a core value here, but one of the things we do like to talk about, one of the three things we like to talk about on the Backstage Pass are money, sex, and politics. So today we're going to hop into a conversation with Ann a little bit about sex. That's something that I know Ann is very passionate about talking with, and amongst many folks, as I actually crossed paths with Ann on Instagram and saw she has a really wonderful sort of open book about, kind of pushing the parameters of sex as we know it, and having really, really open conversations about it. So I'm going to pass the mic over to Ann for a moment so you can tell us a little bit about where you're coming from in the world, and we can dig into a little more conversation and invite our junior board as well. So take it away, Ann.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I work as a certified sex and relationships educator, and I do that in a couple different forms and a couple different mediums. I work individually with people and with couples. I also teach people to teach sex ed. There are a lot of people who are growing more motivated as they learn more about the state of sex education in the United States specifically, and they want to find out what they can do to do their part. And so in my realm, in my world, anyone who works with other people and provides information of some kind, you are an educator automatically. And because sexuality as an identity is a core innate part of most human beings, sex and sexuality ends up becoming a part of almost everything we do. There's some connection you can make between sexual identity or sexuality, in most fields and in most communities that we're in. And so if we can train as many people as we can to have informed, affirming, and accurate conversations about these topics, many of which do intimidate people and confuse people, understandably. The system's actually designed that way to keep us uninformed and confused and then kind of freaked out. The more we're able to actually have conversations about those topics, the more we can really dismantle a lot of the intentional barriers to what's really true and real about being a human being, forced to engage in the culture and communities that we are in. And that can really not only just change lives, but we genuinely do know it also saves lives. So those are some really big things that I do. And even right now, we're in the midst of the fall 2022 sex educator certification that I offer through my organization, Everyone Deserves Sex Ed.
I love that. Everyone deserves sex ed. And I know my sex education was like minimal to none, except for what I was literally teaching myself, right? And I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that. It's like the information we learn is either some variation, like far from what we would probably consider the truth, and also not really helpful in us having a really great relationship within ourselves, let alone other people. And so I really appreciate the work that you're doing around that, because it's obviously got to be, first of all, a lot of heavy lifting, but also knowledge is power, right? In any lane, sector, or conversation. And so on the Backstage Pass, when we dig into conversations around sex, we don't just want to talk about having sex or not having sex. We want to talk about things like consent. We want to talk about things like autonomy of our own sex, gender, things like that. Of course, anybody who's been, slightly awake in the last couple of years have heard all of the back and forths about pronouns, right? Like that has to do with our own identity, all the way to what is being discussed by SCOTUS at any given moment, and how that affects each autonomy, each person's body, right? So really love, actually really enjoy a lot of the stuff that I see from you on Instagram. It's worth definitely checking her out, y'all. The initial intention of holding this space on Monday today, leading up to the big 1 year on the Backstage Pass, was to engage with our junior board. We were doing a little bit of spitballing of ideas on, how to talk about sex in other ways, and what might be pertinent to them as younger people in different areas of STEM. The idea was to see about how talking about our periods and looking at our, opportunity for like a monthly reboot of our bodies, how that could actually inform STEM. Unfortunately, most all of our junior board is ill today. I don't know if it's something in the water over there in Winston-Salem, but sadly, they're not able to join us. But in the true spirit of collaboration, I do want to bring up this topic, maybe not as it pertains to STEM, because Anne's not in STEM, I'm not in STEM, but our mighty fine junior board is all in one way or another. But Anne, I'm just curious what you think about sort of the culture, and not even culture, but like the consumerism around periods and cycles. I mean, for crying out loud, the aisle that you would go to in the drugstore is called feminine hygiene. And
Mhm.
while it isn't necessarily like the most fresh feeling when we have our periods, but like for sure it isn't dirty, right? And so I feel like this is a parallel to what you're demystifying and unpacking with all of your work around sex positivity and sex education. Love to hear your thoughts generally on, how the commodification of the flow has really maybe set us back in time versus like empowered us.
Yeah, I think that because we do live in a capitalist culture, that it is also, of course, white supremacist and patriarchal. They all go hand in hand. They all work together. They all support each other. And so when it comes to commodification of things that are inherently human, like bodily functions or identity, there is always going to be, or there has always been, some kind of industry or some burgeoning industry behind, usually trying to normalize. That's a word that I see used a lot, or streamline things like this that are just, they're very, very human, but really the main intention behind that is just, how can we make money off of this thing? What's really tough, of course, is when there is something that is inherently human, but also been made to be mysterious, kept in the dark, and also as a result be something kind of freaky as well as something shameful, like menstruation. There is an opportunity to make a lot of money as a result, because we don't really know a whole lot about it. We know that we have, many of us specifically who have uteruses of a certain age have to engage with menstruation at some point, unless we want to intervene using something like a hormonal IUD, for example, or using birth control in a way to stop that kind of any kind of monthly bleed in any way. We are looking for like solutions and tools, and we want to find something that to us reads as, we're different, we affirm you, we permit you to be as you are, and here are some tools that we say are going to change your life and make it better. Some of these tools have actually made life worse and not better. Thinking back to just many different types of birth control, for example, that were also marketed to manage periods, which is not actually what that birth control did. It just stopped ovulation, which meant periods didn't actually end up happening. Some of these tools did help and did offer something that wasn't available before. But there was also a catch. There's always a caveat. There's always a conditional. It's conditional support. So for example, a lot of the period tracking apps that have gained steam over the last 5 years, we have access to algorithmic calendars that we can use to try to program our information in, so it can potentially predict what may happen in our future cycles, including when we may potentially be fertile and could potentially become pregnant. People have used that in order to try to become pregnant. People also use them and rely on them disproportionately to avoid being pregnant. The statistics that are sent often with these apps in terms of effectiveness rates are often utilized or based on some small case studies. They are not a percentage that can be relied on as though it was a birth control device, but it is often marketed as an alternative to a birth control that you might get prescribed. It certainly is an alternative, but it's not an equivalent. It's definitely an apple and an orange situation, or even maybe an apple and a cactus situation, because it is not birth control.
Right.
But because, again, these apps offer a service like, okay, I can track this without having to fiddle with my cervical mucus every month and try to put this on the calendar and keep track with a lot of effort. Totally, yes. Also, the catch and the cost of that is all of my data that I put in there is now available, depending on what the privacy policy is. They're all different. It is available for that organization to keep in the cloud and do with it what it will, especially if it is acquired by another company. we don't know if those terms then apply to the successing company. So that's just one example of how, especially in STEM, where we have using, tech and maybe bringing some science in and trying to create some sort of technological solution to an issue. It isn't really a problem. It's only a problem because of the culture we live in. It's made it a problem. We end up, without always knowing, that we could be putting ourselves unwittingly in risks that aren't fully disclosed to us, and could have a future consequence for us, whether that's data being sold, data being used to track us and what's going on with our potential pregnant selves, or something more, including having data sold for future apps to be made and improved. And all at the end of the day, it's that kind of tricky gray area where it's not about good, bad, right or wrong binaries, because binaries really don't exist outside of computers. But it's more about, that gray area of, here are some benefits and here are a bunch of costs. We don't always know all the costs, and that's on purpose so that we focus heavily on the benefits. And how do we reconcile with that? How do we take advantage of the limited resources we do have to manage menstruation, especially for folks who have fibroids or polycystic ovary syndrome or endometriosis, which all of those disproportionately impact Black women and Black people with uteruses. So it's like, how do I benefit from this without potentially putting myself at an additional risk, and just weigh the cost benefit. And of course, because there are so few alternatives, we often just accept the costs, including costs that we find out after the fact, after we've already consented to having our data and information.
So what I hear you say is, like, first and foremost, periods aren't actually a problem, right? Like, it's literally called a cycle, right? And actually there's all sorts of research that supports this. And I've actually experienced it myself when we disengage from it as like a problem, or all of these other sort of like secondary, terrible cramps, like awful mood swings. Actually, if we're taking care of ourselves, if we have access to like the right food and some ample sleep and water and things like this, actually the period becomes less of a problem, right? But we feel like it's an awful problem, and then we get marketed to that it's even bigger problem, and it becomes this sort of like cycle of like, well, I better get this app for it, or I better take this Midol, like whatever. Come on, Midol, get out of here. Like, it's not even.
Yeah. I would even add on, if I may, I would even add on to that, where it's a problem. It's beyond, like, there are some people with uteruses that for them, menstruation is not a matter of if I get enough sleep or if I have access to food that feels nourishing. What I really mean about our culture making periods a problem to then solve in order to mostly make money and control the people who have the periods and keep them kind of in particular places, out of places of power for the most part. It's more about our culture and how it is built in terms of expectations for work. And when you are a worker working for someone else, where you have to show up, the obligations you have day to day that are either enforced on you because of just who you are, or what your circumstances are because of whether it's institutional racism or sexism, where you happen to live. Having a period in those environments becomes the problem. The period's not the issue. It's, how do I have this body engulfing experience in the presence of not only an unhealthy environment for anybody to really live in. 9 to 5 work days, 9 to 9 work days are not actually built to benefit workers, right? It's all built in, it's all part of this big system. It's really like, it is a problem because I don't know how to get to work on time when I am hemorrhaging and I can't even find a pad and a leak-proof underwear and a tampon. That won't stop this flow. How do I get in a car? How do I go someplace else?
So
how do I do any work when I'm in pain all the time?
It's not the bodily function that is necessarily the problem, though. It can be. Many people have very different experiences of what their monthly cycle is like, but it's the culture of which, it's the container of which that health experience is to be expanded on or experienced. And it's groups like Go With the Flow, Dimitri Presley, who's not able to join us today, out of Arizona, big group that is working to get young Black and brown women more resources around this. So they have the tools to, go to school, for example, like Anne was mentioning, right? Like, if we can't find the pad or the tampon so that I can hurry up and make the train and get to work on a day when I'd really just like rather like stay in bed. But I will be, I won't be able to get paid, or I won't be able to have another day off of class or whatever it is. Right. So it's really not just like coming up with solutions on, there's the immediate logistics of how can we make things more accessible, but the bigger idea, and the reason why I'm excited to have conversations like this with Anne, and hopefully when we can get the junior board back on, and other fem forward leaders, is that when we have more conversations like this, right, when we really like pull back the curtain on what's really happening here, and do some truth saying, right, like let's unearth some of this shit that we've literally been fed as like, this is sorry, this is a problem for you ladies. It's like, are you really sorry? Because I don't really feel like this is all wholly supportive, right? When we look at things like even maternity leave and what that looks like, paternity leave, like they're little snaps in the window relative to a bigger health experience that just really isn't intended to be fully supportive of the human. And so I'm glad that we can unearth these things and dig in. It's not always the lightest of conversations, but I will say what we're building on the Backstage Pass is intended to have these kinds of connections with these kinds of people who, like Anne, are literally like, flipping the script on what has been told us our whole life as the truth, and seeing how we can perhaps, write a new narrative, if not for the entire world, if not for our communities, but at least for ourselves, so that we know when we're engaging and what we're engaging with, like that we feel supported. And I know, as you said, Anne, there are lots of people who experience, varying parts of their cycles that can be really hard, and we don't want to diminish that. Everybody should just like rally and like get it together and put a smile on. In fact, like I hope that we can live in a world soon that allows people to, all you have to do is like put a little note up like, Aunt Flo is here. Like, I will be back in 3 to 5 days, right? There used to be historically spaces where people with uterus, people would go and stay outside of the regular culture, the day to day, to rest and to replenish, because it isn't like the easiest day when your period arrives, right? The other thing I wanted to kind of shift to, kind of back to what the initial idea for this conversation, where it came from in chatting with the junior board, is how our periods could be looked at relative to STEM, not necessarily like in app development and tracking your cycle and things like that, as Anne mentioned, which is certainly important to have a look at, like, okay, what information are we really giving? But even from a bigger, like if we zoom out a little bit, like how can the experience of people who have periods be helpful in designing our scientific solutions, our technology upgrades, our engineering processes, and our math equations, right? Because for so long, the area of STEM has been very led by the patriarchy. And so what we came up with in this conversation of talking about periods relative to STEM wasn't necessarily as literal as app development, but like, what would it look like if we really thought about like the cycles of the moon, the cycles of bodies with uterus as we develop, next things for our human existence, So curious to you, Anne, what are, maybe, I know that not to put you right on the spot here as we wrap up, but just like some ideas of how we could build better, how we could be engineering with the future engineering with the future in mind based on our cycles.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing that comes to mind is, and I'm not sure if this is what you have in mind, is just really like when it comes to folks who are in charge of making decisions of creating new things or engineering a new space or creating, the architecture for a waiting room or, whatever it might be, when there are people involved who do menstruate, it may not make a difference with certain designs or certain things being set up. In other ways, it may make a difference in the sense that there may be more bathrooms available in more public spaces or more spaces that are being designed for public or mass use. There would be more accessible bathrooms so that people in wheelchairs or disabled folks who also have periods can easily access these spaces as well in order to take care of what they need to. More privacy when it comes to engaging with our periods, whether it's bathrooms that are designed without big gaps in between stalls and without, gaps on the top and bottom of stall doors, so that it can feel a little bit more private for folks who do struggle with the shame of having to rip open a pad container or, pull out a tampon and figure out how to wrap it up in, paper
Mhm.
towels and stick it into a container. As well as, more restrooms that have disposal containers literally within reach next to the toilet instead of on the other side of the stall or not in the stall at all. Hooks that are in stalls or in public places so that you can hang a jacket or a bag if you do have to use your hands to take out a menstrual cup, for example, dump it out in the in the toilet and then figure out, how do I bring this to the sink covered in blood while also having a bag and a jacket and a shirt, all the other kinds of things. So they're very low tech items or low tech changes.
Mhm.
But until people with lived experience and with it on the forefront of their mind, until they're involved in the decision making and the design processes, these very low tech things aren't always going to be thought of and considered and included in these state of the art new buildings, state of the art new libraries, or public transportation systems. When at the end of the day, when there's no toilet within some kind of easy access distance, to me, it's not the future. It's not high tech whatsoever, no matter how beautiful the
Yeah.
design may look.
Yeah, super great points. I mean, those are all very low tech, potentially simple solves on like a tack list of a architect, of a design firm, of a builder, right? And that's just thinking about building spaces. That's just thinking about our need to actually use the facilities, right? Then we can start thinking about all of the different scenarios where periods could be informed around workplace tempos, timing, right? We experienced a total workplace reshift from COVID, and like suddenly everybody can work remote. Like, what other scenarios could be helpful in supporting people who have periods just around work, the day-to-day work? You mentioned earlier, our work week, our work day is not designed, it's actually based on our agrarian culture, right? Back in the day when we were getting up, and well, not all of us, but many folks were like up in the fields by sunrise and working till sundown, and we still have this setup around that. We don't, I don't know about you, but I didn't plow the fields this morning, right? And so, like, what kinds of things can adjust in our day to day based more on like a full cycle within the month versus just having a full cycle in the day, like a work day or a work week, a slightly
Mhm.
more feminine approach that is more fluid than a structural, like, has to be, we must complete these things in this 1 day cycle versus a 28-day cycle, right?
Sure. Yeah. I think, beyond the even farming, what we see now as our typical work week is actually something that was derived post World War II, once men were back able to go to work. And also women had been working in place of men for so long and needed to find a way to get them back in the house in order to then maintain a home. So the man who was expected to work 9 to 5 could do that while the kids were handled and food was handled. And that is really what our current work is sort of derived from in the 21st century, with the add on of, how can we exploit labor as much as we can for as little cost as possible in order to ultimately make sure that profits really increase for the people at the top, people who own the companies, run the companies, and the shareholders who rely on those people to make them money.
Mhm.
So when it comes to thinking about adjusting how even our work schedule works, I would say you could think of it as a feminine approach. I would think of it as a feminist and a human approach, thinking about the human and the laborer who is creating the product or creating the thing that allows the money to be made or the service to be benefited from in order for the money to be made. And there's a lot of research out there that has shown, among other things, a 9 to 5 isn't built on how our brains actually best function. It's built mostly on not just daylight, because as we know, where depending on where we live, it's dark at 9 regardless, right? Or dark at 5. But it's also built like those are times where we can get someone into an office and keep them there and have it be a low distraction environment to get
Mhm.
them to do what they are paid to do or told to do. What we noticed, of course, during lockdowns and post lockdowns, when most folks were either laid off completely, starting their own businesses out of need, or they were brought home from the office, and we started to normalize working from home and seeing how production could increase, how actual like functionality and task completion started to increase when folks were able to be in a comfortable environment, did not have a commute that cost time and money and energy, were able to juggle not just the task, but also the other thing that was distracting them all day in the office, like the dishes or dealing with something going on in the house or dealing with really comfortable menstruation, for example, they were able to manage all that in the privacy and comfort of their home on their own terms while still doing the job that they were hired to do. And
Mhm.
we're also finding that a 5-day work week with the creation of those 2 weekends also constructed not really to best benefit production and the worker and the humans behind these companies. So if
Mhm.
we're able to adjust the time frames and the spaces within the spaces we use to create and do our jobs, we're able to prioritize things like what's going on with our bodies. And am I able to get up from this chair today? Am I in too much pain where I just can't do it today? I will do it when I am able to breathe comfortably
Mhm.
because my menstrual cramps are that debilitating,
Mhm.
and have the permission for that to exist, to sort of meet ourselves where we're at and allow the people in charge of us to allow us to meet ourselves where we're at. And for there to be a respect for that autonomy and agency of the worker, as well as a trust that the worker knows what they've been hired to do. They know they need to get the thing done. But if they can't do it then, it's not because I don't feel like it. It's because something is genuinely preventing them from doing it. And to say, no problem, I'll look forward to it on Friday, or I'll look forward to it on Tuesday, or whatever the new deadline might be, so
Mhm.
that the person really can feel like an autonomous human with a body that they don't get to control and that they didn't get to choose. And they can manage all of that on their own terms instead of feeling like there's someone who doesn't have that lived experience, doesn't understand, probably doesn't care, definitely doesn't have the empathy for it, but they're the ones who get to call the shots and tell us what to do, regardless of whether we're actually physically capable of it. And this brings in also, elements of ableism too. All of this stuff really intersects, especially when we're having periods that are made debilitating by things like endometriosis.
Mhm.
Some folks consider that a disability. That's an ableism issue when you're expected to still function at work and engage in all of these systems at particular times while your body is literally not able to function as it might normally. If you're still forced to do that and engage in it, that's ableism. And
Mhm.
so we can really bring in all of these different kinds of perspectives to make working in the 21st century something that will still absolutely happen, but isn't as exploitative and for some
Mhm.
people traumatic to have to do, because we have to work. We got to pay our rent, we got to pay our bills. So at the end of the day, it's like that becomes the priority over our own sense of safety and well-being.
Right.
And that's just it's an awful way to live.
And it's so, isn't it, I wanna, like, leave on a positive note, because it's like, if we reflect over the, let's just go 100 years. We can go, I'm sure, farther back, way farther back, right? And we just look at perhaps like our great-grandmother's experience in having what her experience maybe was, right? And think of, we've made some progresses, but it is always important for us to be noticing at what cost, right? And as you mentioned, this is a humanist discussion. This is a humanist issue of people who have periods being able to, like, experience that health experience, right? It happens biologically. We don't get to choose it, as you mentioned, like, we don't get to choose this body, and ultimately be able to still exist in the world and flourish and be, an awesome contributor to a team or a business person or whatever it is, right? It's not because I want to be lazy that I can't accomplish this on the day that my insides feel like they're turning outside, right? And there's a lot of empathy that people with who have periods can say, I feel you. Go ahead. But for those who don't, it's, oh, really? Is it your period? Like, we don't need any of that. That doesn't help, right? And so we have to both, as you say, sort of advocate for ourselves, but I also say we have to advocate for each other and make space on our teams, within our co-working spaces, within our families, my friends who are my family, right? And just showing that, so that we have these concentric circles that help to drive these kinds of progresses forward. And that's what I like to say, with what we're building on the Backstage Pass. It's like same mission, different copy. Of course, what Anne is working on in, the world of sex education is very, very similar to what we're building on the Backstage Pass. Different copy, same mission, right? Like, we're really aiming to have these kinds of conversations that really pull back the curtain on what we've been told for years and years and years and years and milieu of generations, and say, I don't really think that's necessarily true. And what else could how could we do this differently? And so I'm thrilled, Anne, that we've connected. I really wanted you to get to meet the junior board, but wasn't in the cards for today's small talk with big thinkers. So hopefully y'all can connect with Anne again, whether it's on her Instagram. Let me pop this back up here. Anne will also be a guest on the podcast. We're not supposed to say yet, but it's about to drop on Wednesday. So super excited to have Anne return in a longer conversation. And so glad that we could dig into a little bit of the work you do with sex, particularly as it pertains to periods, and how if we pay a little closer attention to the old cycle, how that it could really be helpful and beneficial for moving progress forward in a variety of ways. Anything you'd like to share with us as we wrap up, and final thoughts?
I guess just two things for folks, especially for women who find themselves in positions of power or able to get to that space. Definitely, we can use that power to help dismantle some of this stuff and use that for really good things. And if anybody did feel inspired by some of the more structural and just transparent and very real conversations about things like this, I would encourage you to check out Everyone Deserves Sex Ed, including some of the trainings that we have, in case you might find that benefits you in the work that you're doing and the change that you're trying to make.
Awesome. I love that. I love the mission. Everyone deserves sex ed. I mean, heck yes, everybody. No one's too old, too young. Well, maybe there's a younger cutoff, but at a certain point, learning about the birds and the bees, and even not even calling them birds and the bees, right? Because there's
it's so much more than that. It's in
right.
Sex ed. It's got to start young. It's really just even bodily autonomy. Who gets to hug you and pick you up?
Totally. I mean, we could launch into a whole nother conversation about that, but we can maybe dig on the podcast. Well, Anne, thank you so much for stopping by. Small Talks, Big Thinkers. Really, really glad you were able to share this time with us. So thank you so much. And I hope you have an awesome rest of your day.
You too.
Great. Thanks, Anne. All right, everybody. Well, that was Anne Hodder-Shippe, another amazing human doing amazing things in the world. As you know, we are doing these small talks with big thinkers every day. We started last Monday and we will continue through tomorrow. Well, actually, we have another one, JK, because we ran out of days. We have another one today in like 20 minutes with Susan Schloss talking about money. So just as a recap, like, we're doing these talks with different leaders, thought leaders, different amazing humans doing amazing things around our core values of collaboration, elevation, and inspiration through inclusivity and diversity. So we cruised through those last week. And then so today we're starting conversations about money, sex, and politics because, spoiler alert, we're dropping a podcast. It's the newest digital baby to come to you from the LBI digital ecosystem. We launched last year the Backstage Pass, which you can have a peek here if I can put this link up. If you have yet to come backstage, I don't know what you're waiting for. It's pretty amazing. We talk about money, sex, and politics on a regular basis as we collaborate, elevate, and inspire through diverse and inclusive ways. And we are always learning, so don't try to cancel me. I am a work in progress, and so is the team, the LBI crew. So really, really thrilled that we were able to talk with Anne. I see some of the junior board members still in the green room. Not everyone's feeling up for the chat today, but we will bring them back soon, and I won't keep you all much longer. I see a couple people on the live here, but tune back in 20 minutes. You can meet Susan Flosh, and we'll be talking about money, honey. All right, and then, tomorrow with the amazing Abby Green, we're talking about politics. Remember, the reason we're talking about money, sex, and politics is because when more women not only talk about these things, but activate around the power that money, sex, and politics hold, we end up having more power for ourselves and then more power into our own communities. And that's how we see progress be made. Progress be made? I'm going to have another cup of coffee. It's been a long day already. All right, y'all. I will see you in 20 minutes with Susan talking about money. Ciao for now.